Hello, everyone. Welcome to Two Wartists, One Convo. I'm Chelsea,
And I'm Mallory.
and today we're going to be talking about the Kit Kittredge movie and Nancy Drew.
Circa 2007.
And 2008.
Yes.
Well, we can go ahead and introduce ourselves. So I'm Chelsea, junior creative writing and literature major.
And I am Mallory. I'm a sophomore, information systems and theater major. So I am an actor as well as a multi-hyphenate theater artist.
Mm-hmm. And I'm a playwright and hopefully a future author. So
Excellent.
both artists in our own right.
Yeah, so basically we've gathered here today to discuss exploring and analyzing feminist and post-feminist representation in the set of Kit Kittredge and Nancy Drew films from the early 2000s that were specifically targeted to young adolescent women.
Mm-hmm. We, as artists, we both want to have more feminist media, so it's kind of our goal as we're looking at, representation to have more feminist media in our own creations.
Yeah, it's just really specifically looking at our roots and understanding that these were movies that really impacted us and being like, okay, well, why did they? Why did they stick with us? And I think really we ended up settling on that they taught us something, right?
Yeah, definitely. So the two movies are Nancy Drew, 2007, directed by Andrew Fleming, starring Emma Roberts, beloved Emma Roberts, and then Kit Kittredge, An American Girl, which is a 2008 movie directed by Patricia Rozemba, starring Abigail Breslin.
Yeah. And so, as we said, they each taught us something different. And also, they're both mystery movies. So they're like little detectives and they have to go against the bad guys. And we think it's really unique that young women got the opportunity to do that. And then just looking at some, when the Kit Kittredge movie was created, and maybe Chelsea can speak a little bit more to this, but the producers of it, they really wanted the girls to resonate with the protagonist, with Kit.
Yeah, that was the thing with American Girl, right? The historical ones in particular, they just really want the girls to resonate with these characters, even though they're different time periods. They're not experiencing explicitly the same things. They're not experiencing the Great Depression in the early 2000s, but they are still feeling the many things that Kit feels when she's dealing with her parents and all the things that she was used to changing. So yeah, it was a very big movie, especially since Kit Kittredge was the first American Girl movie to be released in theaters. All the ones up till then were made for TV or straight to DVD release. So
yeah, and then the Nancy Drew movie, it hit number 7 on the charts when it was released. So it also did really, really well. I don't know if it was huge financial success, but in terms of support, it was right up there with the Silver Surfer, which is a Marvel X-Men movie or a Marvel Fantastic Four movie. I don't know. So it was charting, which is really cool, and for young girls and everything, and because we make popular culture. I mean, who made the Beatles? Who made the Beatles popular?
Exactly. And I also remember when I was a kid and I watched Nancy Drew. After I watched the movie, I made my own sleuthing kit. She has a thing in the movie where she has this little kit of all of a magnifying glass, your little notebook, and I got a purse from a garage sale, and I made my own sleuthing kit because I wanted to be like her. I didn't really want to be a detective, but I thought it was fun to have that power. So
yeah, that's so fair, because I remember watching the Kit movie, and we American Girl love stuff was so expensive.
It is.
And so we watched the Kit movie and we were like, oh my gosh, we can make things just like her. And so my sister and I made our own refrigerator and house and all their decorations, and we made all their food and all this fun stuff, and I felt it was really creatively empowering. And then kind of going on that as well is that we want our art to be creatively empowering, and we want to create more feminist media. And specifically, we looked at, I'm a theater artist, Chelsea's a playwright, so we looked at some theater for young audience things, and ultimately they were saying that what's really impactful is when artists have intent behind things. So they're purposely creating things, but then also, particularly with young audiences, overwhelmingly they were finding meaning in things that the producers and writers and directors didn't necessarily intend them to. So kids are smart. And it's really important that we give them content and things that they can think about, and then, they can just kind of like riff on that. I mean, I think for me at least, as an artist, you have to take leaps and you have to create meaning out of seemingly disparate things. Be like, this cup and this tissue are, they mean something or whatever. And then you find those connections, and sleuths do that as well. So that's why I always loved mystery movies, because it was very creatively fulfilling. And then representing young women, partaking in like this freedom to like explore and ask questions is so radical, because we just constantly give them restrictions just all the time. Like, even if they're doing well, that's a whole trope of like having to sit next to the boy in class who's like making trouble. So they're always operating under restrictions, and the fact that they get to just be like free adolescent femme presenting people is awesome, and they don't have to be consumeristic and vain.
Yeah, and little girls like should be able to see that, so they can grow up like emulating that and keeping those ideas in mind. So it's important to have those from a young age.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess since we're discussing feminism and post-feminism, we should probably define it.
Oh yeah. So feminism is a it's a buzzword, been heard around a lot. So general equality for women compared to men. There's different ways of feminism. There's, I don't know how many of them, 5, 6?
4.
4?
Currently.
Oh, whoops. Well, 5. 4. The first wave was like voting rights. The second wave was more like workplace and domesticity, like the separation between that. There's a lot of stuff going on with that. But essentially, it's a thought process that puts women in the forefront. So when we're looking at these movies, that's what we're going to try to do, is to kind of examine the feminist representation and using like a feminist lens, like looking at the characters as women in these stories. And then post-feminism is where it gets more complicated.
It's a bit more complicated. So if we look at what sociologist Rosalind Gill said, post-feminism is a complicated topic, quote unquote. So basically, over the past 20 years in which it's existed, like, they really have debated what it really means. So some people used the term as a time after second wave feminism. Others have used it to delimit like a new kind of feminism, while others have still used it to refer solely to backlash against feminism. So those are all 3 very different things, but basically we're going to center on the fact, and this is what Rosalind Gill talks about in some of her thoughts post her seminal article in 2007, and then is that post-feminism should be considered a critical object. So it's a circulating set of ideas, images, and meanings having several repetitive features, and we'll talk about those repetitive features, and that's really what we're able to analyze in the film. So think of it as a semblance, think of it as, just something to ponder, rather than something that's like really actually concrete, because no one really knows how to practice it right now. So at its core, it focuses on a framework that goes beyond the aspirations of feminism, with the assumption that maybe sexism has been fixed, and it's a critique. So it's observations that there's a duality to every single thing. They're like, yes, women are sexual, and then they're like, but they also don't have to be. So that is why it is really just a semblance of ideas. And we believe that we are setting out as a definition that it is not in direct contrast to feminism, and we will use it, like Gil says, as a direct set of conventions that appear in women's lives and thus in their media. But yeah, so before, I guess, we start analyzing our, what is it, mise en scene?
Mise en scene.
Mise en scene. Our frame, like we said earlier, just shouting out that our framework is intention as artists and fully creating that. And I think what's really interesting is looking at the movie of the Portrait of a Lady on Fire, is that as like artists, when we use our creativity to assert intention and the things we create, it allows us to go deeper than the surface level than just popular feminism often hits. So in that movie in particular, like, they were looking at costumes, and they used coloring to assign roles to the women so that they could just follow them. But the colors didn't mean, like, if the one was wearing red, it didn't mean she was deviant.
Like angry or something.
Yeah. The blue one wasn't like depressed, but it still meant something and had intention, because the artist, the costumer, was using it as a way to identify the characters. So there can be an intention, there can be a deeper meaning, but it can also just be intention in like creating a color scheme.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many moving parts to movies that we're just like, we're looking at everything with a framework of intention, that everything is intentional. And as artists, we have to keep in mind our intentions whenever we're creating something.
Yes. So digital media has afforded spaces and places for contemporary feminism and feminist messages of gender inequality, body positivity, and these are going to circulate and achieve visibility in multiple media platforms. And this is what Gil and some of her colleagues have said. And we believe that having that intention allows us to go deeper than just what social media is allowing people to do with activism right now. So, but I'm really excited to jump into what we have.
Yeah, oh my god, going blast to the past, going back to these movies. So, we're gonna start looking now, in particular, the post-feminist and feminist, like, lenses of these films. So first we're gonna talk about, like, feminist, because you gotta have to start with the feminist to get into the post-feminist. But then we also have to go back to the OG, Laura Mulvey.
We have
Laura
to talk
Mulvey.
about men.
We have to talk about men, because that's where the problems stem from. So Laura Mulvey was a film theorist. She came up with the idea of the male gaze in film. So essentially, it's a lot of things, but it's like the patriarchal subconscious that impacts film. That could be like cinematic elements, so how things are framed, how they're shot, or like the narrative elements, like how the women are portrayed in the film, like as characters. We've talked about Vertigo a lot. That is one that Mulvey cites a lot in talking about the male gaze and how it's very voyeuristic. And
like, they they have all these adult things in it, like she's a prostitute, and they're like, oh, look at her in this glorious lighting, and we're not going to say anything, but we are going to just constantly knock her down. We're gonna kill her off. We're going to have her just be berated by men, but we're never actually going to explicitly state why.
Yeah, it's just the patriarchal subconscious that impacts film, and as film impacts so many other things. So after that, a lot of people are like, okay, there's a male gaze, but like, what about a female gaze? So, film scholar Erica Balsam is who we're going to be examining and how she looks at the female gaze and defines it. She has a list of like 6 principles, 6 things that kind of constitute the female gaze. So we want to dive into those in context of Kit Kittredge and Nancy Drew, seeing how they utilize the female gaze, because both movies use it a lot, pretty much all the time, I would say.
They are definitely feminist movies, which is it's really great to be able to pinpoint something back in our childhood and say, you know what, that was feminist. That was the female gaze, because we're gonna take us through all these 6 steps, but spoiler alert, it meets all 6 of them. Both of them do.
Yeah. So the first one, I feel like, is one of the easiest one, is that the main character of the film identifies as a woman. That works for both movies. In Kit Kittredge, in American Girl, Kit Kittredge is the titular American Girl. She identifies as a woman, and then Nancy Drew is the same way, identifies as a woman. And that part of their identity is a big aspect of their character. Second one is that the story is told from her perspective. Kit Kittredge, that is kind of like the thing of American Girl. That's like their gimmick, is that these stories are told from the perspectives of young girls. So the whole story is her POV.
Yeah, and even further than that, on a cinematic note, is that they're both subjective. So a subjective point of view is when you as an audience member, you really feel like you're part of it, and this happens over and over again, and like you really get to see these young women and these in their girlhood experiencing their lives. And so, for instance, you have literal instances in which the camera takes their point of view, and so the man has just robbed someone of their wallet in Kit Kittredge, and he's running by and he has got a tattoo of a bird, and it becomes very important towards the end of the movie. And we see Kit see it, and then we see the man at her level run by her, and so that's like her direct point of view in which the camera has taken over. And also, then there's another character named County in Kit, and this is a really interesting character because County is actually dressed as a young boy for the majority of the film, and that's because their caretaker, Will, who they're both transient workers together, young, and he's taken care of her because both of her parents have died, and so they're traveling the rails together, and he's like, well, it's not safe for young girls to ride the rails, so I dressed her up as a boy. And we don't know this in the very beginning of the movie, but the camera takes her perspective of this garden party in which it's like this delicious table with all of these like little treats and sandwiches, and it's this beautiful like right dolly shot of it, and it's her gaze watching it. And I think it's so interesting that she's dressed up as a little boy, but we still get the female gaze even though she's dressed up as it. I think that's something to ponder, but I'm going to consider it the female gaze because she's a little girl.
Yeah, and it's not just kid, you know, it's also county and like their story as well, because they do become like very important characters later on. Spoiler alert, there's the whole thing about the mystery and like who stole the lockbox. They become like the suspects for it, and so to have that in the beginning, I feel like is very telling
Yeah.
of what the story is going to be. And like the juxtaposition of like this beautiful garden party where all of these like affluent suburban people are like having this party kind of unaware of what's going to happen with like the Great Depression, and then you have these two kids who are like on their own, trying to make ends meet, like watching on, and they're just like, we just want to work for food. They don't even want money, they just want to work for food. So to have like that juxtaposition in the beginning too is
Yeah,
very telling.
and those are just both in the first 15 minutes of the movie. So Nancy Drew, we have to wait a little longer to see her perspective, and it's really interesting with the character that it happens with, because we have some some stills for our friends tuning into our video, and so there's a groundskeeper who lives in the mysterious house that she and her dad move into in LA, and she's like poking around, can't sleep, goes and finds this like secret hidden movie room. And the first time we ever see her point of view is when she is looking at the groundskeeper and he catches her in that room and he's like, "What are you doing in here?" And she's like, I'm just being nosy because that's what I do. I'm Nancy Drew.
It was like her first moment of really getting nosy about this mystery, because the whole premise of the movie is that like she's in a small town and then she moves to LA with her dad, and her dad's like, "You're not allowed to sleuth anymore because you need to focus on being like quote unquote a normal girl." And Nancy Drew, she's like, "Okay, sure," but she really does not stop sleuthing, and she chose to live in this house because of this mystery surrounding it. And so she starts like investigating this mystery. She gets like her first lead, like her first big clue about this woman who died there. And like that's like when this still happens, is when she gets caught like in the middle of finding like this big lead.
Yeah, and the cinematic element that's really cool about it is that it's her perspective, and this is a movie in which Nancy Drew never loses her power, like ever. She is the protagonist, and even though this still in particular, it's her point of view, it's looking up. The camera is tilted up at the groundskeeper, so theoretically that would indicate that he has the power in the scene, but he really doesn't, because there's no consequences for what she does, and he ends up becoming an ally to her in the end. And so I think what's really great is we're seeing it from her point of view, and we're seeing what should be a power dynamic shift, but it's really not in the context of the story. It might seem like it, and I think that's what it is like for a lot of girls. Like when they run into authority, they're like, "Oh my gosh," and then you just have to stay steadfast and be be there. And she does, and she asserts everything that she wants, and she makes this into a non-issue, the whole tilt of the camera thing. But that moves into our next point, which is that for Balsam, the story of our lovely protagonist has to call into question the patriarchal order, and boy do both of these call it into question.
Do. I feel like it automatically kind of does with these stories are, since they're detective stories, and having like that authority is kind of already attributed to like masculinity, and since they both are already challenging these authorities by being these detectives, it's kind of inherently already there. But like the characters themselves are very strong. So like in Kit Kittredge, yes, she like works to like sleuth out who stole this lockbox, and she works with her friends and subverts everything. But then there's the whole storyline of her wanting to be a reporter. Her whole thing is she wants to grow up being a reporter. She wants to work for the Cincinnati Enquirer. So she's been writing these stories. In the beginning, she writes a story about the world, what is it called?
The World Fair.
The Chicago World Fair. And she wants to write about this, so she writes a story, goes to the Enquirer, shows it to the person, like the head editor, and he's like, you're just like a little girl, like you're just a kid, like this story isn't fresh. She's dismissed by this like a lower person on the staff at first, and then she like tries to get to the editor, and it doesn't even work at first, but she does not give up.
And the second time is when a really fun cinematic convention happens, because there is this genuine barrier in her narrative, as Chelsea has just explained, of her getting to access the actual getting to be in print. And so she brings the editor her next story, and it's about kindness and honor, love and honor in the, as she calls it, the hobo community, because she is getting to know these people who've been put out of a job and are living in something that's different than the societal conventions. And then the editor closes his door in front of her, and we see a shot in which is shot of her pressed up against the frosted glass of his office, and it's like it's genuinely like a glass wall, like genuinely the glass ceiling, and it's frosted too, just indicating like her being young and her being, you know, a girl, and she can't access this. And then she continues to work through the rest of the movie to access it. And it's not a totally, the movie itself is not a totally liminal, like linear narrative, because they throw the mystery in there and you're like, what is going on? But it genuinely goes and ties back to how she is able to get published and get through that glass door. And so I think the fact that they chose to film through that and show her, you know, like silhouette through the door is really important. And then Nancy Drew also, in terms of her career, is very, very feminist and very much works through questioning the patriarchal order, because she is a detective. And so she does the police's job for them.
She does. And like at the beginning of the movie, when she has like her first like heist that she's solving, everybody's like a big fan of her in her small town. They're like, we love Nancy Drew,
which is so funny that it's not the good old boy system.
Yeah, they're like literally calling Nancy Drew to like help out with these problems. But then when she goes to LA, her dad like kind of becomes that figure that's stopping her, kind of representing that patriarchal order that's stopping her from sleuthing, even though it's like for, in his opinion, for like her greater like interest, like for being like quote unquote a normal girl. But she eventually goes against that. I mean, she not even eventually, she does like explicitly go against it, but eventually like he finds out about it. But it doesn't stop. Like she just keeps going, and she is successful by the end of it, completely going against everything that her dad was telling her. She solves the crime.
She takes down capitalism. Because her dad literally says to her, they're sitting in a limo. It's this like very parallel shot in which they're on the same page in the camera. The camera's looking at them both the same, and he's like, oh well, you know, if it turned out that the daughter of, you know, of the murdered woman gets her money, if the like estranged daughter, then this company that runs her estate is going to go bankrupt. And Nancy's like, I don't care. It goes to the right people. And I think this so goes to how she was originally published, because the heroine, so this is a quote from a book, and the heroine developed in the initial volumes an assertive young woman who didn't hesitate to oppose or contradict adults. Ritt often said in later years that Stratemeyer, who was the one who commissioned Nancy Drew, he wrote The Hardy Boys, and that Stratemeyer was bitterly disappointed with her early manuscripts because he felt that she had overstepped the bounds of propriety. He found Nancy too flippant and aggressive for a girl. And then, like, there's also this double message, because Nancy really idolizes her relationship with Carson Drew, who's her father. And so it's like, it allows readers to see Nancy as very powerful in her personality, but then also, she also doesn't talk back to authorized patriarchs. Because even in the film, in the 2007 film, she makes the comments about the police being bad at their jobs, not to them. She makes it to her dad. So he's like her trusted advisor. And I think, you know, that goes to the duality that post-feminism, and we'll get to that, is trying to, you know, examine, because if they don't, post-feminism trying to examine that there's a duality. And so, yeah, she takes on patriarchal norms, but she still has a good relationship with her dad.
My favorite part of that was in the limo scene that you mentioned earlier, when they're when the guys are talking about the money, and she realizes that this guy is the bad guy. She just turns to her dad and she's like, Dad, we need to get out of this car, like you need to leave. And he like doesn't really question it. He's just like, oh, okay. And I just love like that their dynamic is like that, and that he like respects her so much, even though she's like blatantly defying everything that he's told her. He just knows that like she really is like a strong woman.
Yeah, and then she pulls a ladybird and just like throws herself out
of the vehicle.
Oh my god, yeah. So, but moving on to number 4, we're rounding out Balsam's points. The film has to be constructed in a manner that allows the spectator to feel the female experience. This is what we were saying earlier with the subjective point of view, is that you feel the female experience in these movies. And so one moment that I would talk about, we have another still.
I can hold it.
Yeah, you want to hold it?
You really like this point,
I love this moment. So this is non-diegetic sound that happens. So they're having a treehouse ceremony, and they're like, these are the members of our treehouse. And don't you worry, Amelia Earhart is one of the members. And so there's this non-diegetic sound, and it's very, you know, it's very romantic, and it's like, you know, so mystical and magical that they're getting to swear in another one of their members. And then all of a sudden, this music turns very, very sad, and it's like this horn sound, and you're like, what's going on? And then you see the girls stand up and look out the window, and their friend's house is being foreclosed on. So it's like, this is like a pivotal childhood moment for them. And the way that they did it with the music, it's just so so rearing. And like we found studies that said that they can connect emotions to music of films, and that there's like specifically 9 different emotions that they can connect to the underscore of a film, which is really important. And so the fact that they recognized, and I mean, I said, you know, I feel like sometimes I have a soundtrack in my head, and they very much represented that. And then also it's just this beautiful shot and of this total 3-point lighting in which they have the fill, they have the key, they have the backlight, and so they're just beautifully well lit, and it's like clearly a magical moment, and this treehouse is a magical space for them. So the fact that they've represented that in the cinematic elements, I think, is so important. And then also we have a lot of eyeline matches in Kit Kittredge as well, moving on from that scene, and just that we'll see someone look someplace and then it'll cut to them. So a lot of the people in Kit's life are older women, and it'll represent that. And so we can see like kind of where she's going to go as an adult, like who her mom is, who the example is what she's setting. And so basically eyeline match, they're going to show the shot of the person looking off in one direction, and then the second shot shows a nearby space containing what he or she sees. So it's not necessarily the camera coming in and taking the point of view, but it's still their point of view, and it's still seeing the world from their gaze. And then Nancy Drew has a lack of elliptical editing, which is really cool. So that in particular is like, it's Nancy Drew is so clever. She's so clever, and we don't ever question why she's doing it, because elliptical editing pulls away, so that it's kind of like, oh, what are the characters doing? We can't really tell. Mm-hmm. You can always tell what Nancy Drew is doing. You're like, oh, that girl is on top of it. Yeah. So she's like breaking out. Oh my gosh. She's like breaking out of of being kidnapped by, you know, professional kidnappers, and she's trying to get the will, and we see the camera track down with the paper clip in which she's attaching the will to as she pulls the will up onto the scaffolding, which she is. And you're like, this girl's gonna do it, because they don't do this like skewed elliptical editing where it's like, oh my gosh, is she gonna get away with it? You're kind of like, are the goons, are the cronies who have kidnapped her, are they gonna look over and see the paper flying? But you're never questioning Nancy's judgment. You're only ever questioning the judgment of the people around her, thus seeing her point of view.
Yeah, and like another point like I think about is like the scene with the bomb was left in her car, and now she just like immediately picked it up and ran with it and like just threw it in like a manhole in the ground, and how you don't question it. You're like, yeah, she's just getting rid of the bomb. You're not gonna question like anything that she's doing. And it's really, yeah, like Mallory was saying, her POV. It's not directly from her eyes, but you're still like experiencing it there.
Yeah, and it's like, as artists, yeah, things can happen and be a little magical and be a little convenient. Like the manhole being there for her to throw that in, that was very convenient for her. But again, there's still this presence of mind in which the character is doing. She's like, oh my gosh, I need like someone to come. She's like, I've got it. And they slowed it down. They put it in a slow-mo frame. Yeah. And you watch in this slow-mo as everything is happening around her, and she has got it. And so it's like this intention of, yeah, we're going to make it really easy because it's a kid's movie for her to solve this problem. But we're not going to question if she's capable of doing it or not. We're not going to question her agency, which is really nice. And so I think then this is kind of moving on to a different convention of being artists, of being playwrights or actors. And so number 5 is, if bodies are eroticized, it must be a conscious gesture. And so bringing back Mulvey.
Yeah, because Mulvey was talking about how like the male gaze is like the patriarchal unconscious, that like feminine bodies are going to be eroticized in some way. Like once again, we talk about Vertigo. That is kind of like the titular example that Mulvey really touches on. How her body from like behind, like that scene when they're in the restaurant, is like zoomed in on. It's very like voyeuristic, in that the character is unaware of that she's being watched. But for this movie, neither of them are eroticized really in any way, and it kind of goes back to intention and casting. We found some interesting stuff about like the casting of both movies. So HBO was one of the people who like produced, like the main people who produced the Kit Kittredge movie, and they had a casting call looking for the girl to play Kit Kittredge, because she's such an iconic figure. And American Girl was a doll brand first. So this article we found says that HBO Films and American Girl are casting a wide net for doll-faced moppets to fill the east of the company's first theatrical feature, and then it starred Abigail Breslin, who ended up being cast as Kit. But it was very interesting that they referred to these actors, these young actors, as doll face. Like they were looking for someone to really fit that mold of like doll-like. It's not like eroticized in a way, but it's still very weird feeling. I don't know, to like look for someone to really fill that mold and be like that person based on appearance alone. And then another thing we also talked about was like for Nancy Drew. It's kind of unseen that Emma Roberts was actually the age of her character in the film. She was actually 16 when Nancy Drew was made. It's also interesting to note that after this movie, she has gone on to play like for years, like I don't know how many decades, but like really young characters like beyond her age range in like Scream Queens and all of that. Her characters are usually very young. But this movie, she was actually the age that her character's meant to be. And I feel like that's very important, like looking at intention. Is like, yes, Kit Kittredge is like, they looking for someone who's like doll-like, but the girls were able to see like Kit and see the doll and see like her and like see themselves in her in a way, because
she's also their age.
Yeah, also their age. And they could really picture themselves in like her, you know, her story, dealing with stuff she's dealt with, being strong, and like leading their own story. And same with like Nancy Drew, is that the older, you know, 16, 15-year-old girls could really see themselves as her because she was that age. It wasn't you know, Riverdale, where it's like 20, 25-year-olds masquerading as high schoolers, like upwards of like 30-year-olds. So it's nice to have that and have that representation.
And as artists, you can make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's nothing that's stopping you from casting intentionally and making sure that you're creating an equitable space. And of course, American Girl actually hasn't done a great job of representing their women of color dolls in movies and things. Like, they've actually quite struggled with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's unfortunate. But it's saying that, like, if they can do such a good job with a movie like Kit Kittredge, where, you know, they find someone who fits ultimately the look that they want, but they're still going to make an empowering movie which meets all 6 of these criteria, they should be able to do it with women of color. Mm-hmm. And any other artist should be able to do it, because like these basic tests, like the Bechdel test, are just not enough. Like if American Girl doll can do this, so can any other big studio. And so mm-hmm. that takes us to our last point, is that this is, you know, and we do have to talk about this with media for young girls. And so it is that the pleasure of spectators does not stem from the scopic drive from taking pleasure in objectifying a person through the gaze like a voyeur. And we do have to talk about it, because it's like shows like Euphoria are out there. It's like, who is the audience for this? This is not...
I've always wondered that.
This is not... The audience for Nancy Drew and Kit Kittredge are middle school girls, because they can see themselves in Kit Kittredge, and also they're doing that kind of like aspirational thing with Nancy Drew. Mm-hmm. And so this is a great quote from one of the reviews of Nancy Drew, and it says, "In Nancy Drew, director Andrew Fleming keeps Nancy smart, resourceful, and fully clothed." Because that is a 16-year-old playing a 16-year-old that like 12 to 16-year-olds are looking up to, and that is so important to give them agency in something that is not looks, because we know that only certain people with a certain look are going to be represented well. So that kind of brings us into our closing thoughts on feminism as we run into post-feminism. Mm-hmm. Is that the two films are definitely feminist, period.
Mm-hmm. They really incorporate the female gaze throughout, as defined by Balsam. Yeah, I personally thought as a kid, like, they were really good, like, empowering movies, like, in the feminist way. But yeah.
No, I agree. So Gill, Rosalind Gill, in her article, she sets out a couple different post-feminist examinations, and we're going to just pull from a few, and starting with that femininity is a bodily property. And so as we look at post-feminist structures in media, there's always a dichotomy. So going into this femininity, bodily property, we can look into specifically how Miss Dooley and Mrs. Howard, who are two of the boarders at Kit Kittredge's house, interact. So our lovely dance instructor, Miss Dooley, she is looking for a husband. She's a dance instructor. She is not afraid to show a little leg, and that is represented in her costuming, represented in her movement, and her choreography, and her direction. And there's a shot reverse shot of her and Mrs. Howard going back and forth, and Mrs. Howard is just giving her a disapproving look. She's like, mm-mm. And so that's kind of the duality with femininity as a bodily property, because it's saying that like women can really own this. They can really own their femininity. They can really own being, you know, looking for a husband and primping themselves and doing all that stuff, or they can also respect the desire not to.
Yeah, exactly.
So then with Nancy Drew, I wanted to pull this quote and say that Gil says, conventionally attractive women can be indicted for having fat ankles or lateral lines. And this is a window into the individual's, their exterior look is a window into the individual's interior life. Emma Roberts is an actress. She's obviously conventionally attractive, and yet in this movie, she as Nancy Drew is painted by her classmates as an ugly duckling, and they're genuinely trying to bully her for having life skills.
Yeah, literally, they were like, "Who here knows CPR?" and then use it like as a way to like embarrass her.
And then both of these movies in particular, kind of an aesthetic choice that represents femininity is a sepia lens. So you can put a sepia lens on a camera and it makes everything soft and gorgeous and lush and light. And both of them use it. And it really is an aesthetic choice that is making them feel a little dated and definitely like they're trying to feel feminine. And so that kind of ties into that. But
yeah, it makes it feel soft. Like, I know it was used mainly in Kit as like a way to date it to like the 1930s, but it also was used in Nancy Drew to also date it, but create like a liminal, like, time period, because it is like the early 2000s. She does have like an iPod, but like when she goes to LA, or like when she's in her hometown, and like her home, it feels like the time is kind of frozen there because of like those choices to make the lens, to make everything feel soft.
Right, and again, that is an intentional choice, and you can use a sepia lens to be really beautiful, but you could also, which is what they do, and they create, I mean, I'm obsessed with that treehouse shot that we talked about earlier. You can use it to be really beautiful and really wonderful, but you can also use it to like cover up things or do it in a different way. And so like you have to use these choices, these aesthetic choices, as artists in a very particular way, and you have to do it in a respectful manner to that there is a duality to everything, and you have to pick where you're going to fall on that. So what's our second point with that?
Is it objectification to subjectification?
Yeah, so kind of elaborating on this because not a lot of people know what post-feminism is that Gill states, to be critical of the shift is not to be anti-sex, but rather it is a point to the dangers of such representations of women in a culture in which sexual violence is endemic. Furthermore, only some women are highlighted. And so, again, this goes to like, with movies for young girls, do we really want to be talking about the endemic like sexual violence? No, but it exists.
It does exist. Yeah.
It's part of post-feminism to look at. And so, ultimately, representation is very important, and there's actually a lovely social activist group called the Guerrilla Girls who talk about artist representation in museums and things like that. And so only 37% of protagonists in 2017 of films were women. And then it goes down even more substantially when you get into like the fine arts and the actual studio arts. And so they specifically said, like, do women have to be naked in order to get into your museum?
Yeah, like they had, so I've seen like the original Guerrilla Girls art when I was in London last summer, and to see like all that stuff like be in an actual museum like next to tons of other pieces they had up at the Tate Modern, and it was like, do women have to be naked to be, you know, in art? And then you like go like 2 rooms over to be displayed in museums, and you go like 2 rooms over and you see like a bunch of naked women, and you're like, interesting, this really, like, you can really see the connections here.
Yeah. And so this kind of goes to the cinematic elements, and that Nancy Drew is framed in this movie as very, very self-starter, very independent. She's not changing herself in this narrative that they've created. It's very straight line in that she is who she is. She's like, I am not going to be a sleuth, but I am going to be a sleuth. And then I'm going to solve my mystery that I set out to do. And then she ends up getting her boy in the end. So we have a still here of Ned kissing Nancy Drew at the very end. And again, this is this whole like objectification, subjectification, and that you can look nice for a boy, and then you can also look nice for yourself. And Nancy Drew is dressing, and we'll touch on this later, Nancy Drew is dressing in the style that she wants to for herself. And then Ned just happens to be there. She's like, this is my good friend Ned. And then of course when she moves back to River Heights, you know, they do this beautiful close-up shot of them, you know, having their little romantic moment, and it's very age appropriate. And it also doesn't stem from her being like, oh, in the midst of this murder that I'm trying to solve, let me look nice for this boy. Like, no, she's got her style and she's sticking to it, and that's framed throughout the whole movie. And then, you know, we see the camera be does the zoom in shot. It represents, you know, yeah, the audience was rooting for this, and it's okay for the audience to root for a romantic lead at the same time that we have strong independent women. So
Yeah, another part I like to talk about, like that section in particular, like when they're smooching, is like right before they do that, or is it after? I don't know, but right at that moment, he's like talking about her sleuthing, and she's like, I just can't stop sleuthing, and he's like, oh, I know, and like completely aware of like who she is and how she like runs off like as soon as they're done kissing, because she hears like her dad's like, Nancy, there's a call in like Ireland about the Loch Ness monster, and she's like runs off. She's like, oh my god, another mystery, and he's just like, ah, shucks, like that's Nancy for you, and like doesn't like critique her anyway, and just likes her holistically for who she is and like her independence. So that was another like good moment.
Which is so fair, and that kind of brings in the other point of Balsam, or not Balsam, Gil that we're looking at, is that there's an emphasis on self-surveillance in post-feminism, and that women will regulate and monitor themselves to a certain standard, whether that be like grooming of their interior life. And there's a moment in Kit Kittredge in which it happens. So Kit Kittredge, there's a quote from one of Gil's articles, and it says, what kind of a friend, lover, daughter, or colleague are you? Like, these are the questions that women are being asked, and young women are being asked. And so in Kit Kittredge, Kit regulates herself to not negatively affect those around her. So one key example comes from a scene in which she's writing a letter to her dad, and Kit is the narrator of her story, first off, and she narrates it through what she's typing on her typewriter, and she starts, everything's going wrong. Like, their house has been foreclosed, the theft has happened, like all of their savings have been stolen, and we get this shot, and so there's a jump cut to establishing a shot of her in the treehouse, and then there's another jump shot to cutting, and there's diegetic thunder and hammering, which is just this invasive sound, and this very non-diegetic music. We do a jump cut to her mother, who's desperate and sad and looking at a picture of her father, and then we do another jump cut to Kit back in the treehouse, and there's a zoom where it's this long take in, and like Abigail Breslin is doing an incredible job acting, because there's tears streaming down her face, and she's typing, and she's telling him everything that's going wrong. And then there's a moment where they call back from earlier in the film where the pin in the typewriter goes, and it like gets stuck. It's a little booking, and she looks at it, and it's a centering moment in which you can tell she's asking herself, what kind of daughter, friend, you know, am I? And she goes, you know what? I have to be a good daughter. I can't let him know that we're literally not going to be in the house that he left us in when he gets back from Chicago. And it's this, like I said, it's this long zoom in shot, and we follow then Kit's gaze to looking at a picture of her father, and then we do a following shot of her ripping the paper out and crumpling it up, and then her starting. And it's also worth mentioning silence whenever it comes into movies. This is from a quote of an article in which we found from Superhowski, and which it's worth mentioning silence, which influences the way we perceive the surrounding sounds. And when that pin pops, silence. There's no more not diegetic sound of the music or anything. And that just really is a resonating moment in which I think that point of Gil's in post-feminism, the emphasis on self-surveillance is really prevalent, because these two girls are dealing with really adult themes, and that real young girls deal with adult themes, and you have to do a lot of self-surveillance. So the fact that it was in this moment in Kit Kittredge, and they chose to put that in there, and they chose, because a lot of Kit Kittredge's jump cut, and that they did this long take in which they zoomed in on her, and they have, you know, her like little tears coming down, and she looks so sad. And they do that, you can tell that there is just intention and honor behind that, of wanting to show the types of things that she's really going through as a human being. And I really, really appreciated that. And, you know, that goes into monitoring and discipline, which is another point of Gil's.
Very true. So, monitoring and discipline.
Yeah. This is just a statistic in which it comes from. Again, we previously talked about Kit and Nancy being like so hard in their professions. They're pre-professionals at the mere ages of 12 and 16. And so in terms of screen, a larger portion of men, more than women characters, are seen to be in their work setting. And so the fact that we get to see both of them in their work setting, and they're kind of unconventional work settings, is pretty unique.
Pretty much the entire movies, like the sleuthing, you know, because it works that Nancy is a detective, like she's sleuthing like the entire movie, she's in her work setting, and like Kit does not want to be a detective, but she wants to be a reporter and like borderlining like on investigative journalism. So she like is a detective in her own right. So she's working like in her mind to better herself as a writer.
Yeah. And it's through Kit's occupation that we actually get to see even more of her gaze, because they take the time to edit in the photographs that she's taking. And so those are things that she's seen through her lens, and then we get to see them. And so it's really great that it connects back to her work, back to the thing that she ends up accomplishing, because she ends up getting published in the Cincinnati Enquirer in the very end of the movie. And then we get to also see her gaze through her work, which is great. And it's not just, and you know, postmodernism talks about how there can be, you can work in your home, you can work out in the streets, out in the real world, you know, outside of the loveliness of your home or the chaos of your home, you know, whatever it may be. And we get to see that with little 12-year-old kids. And then our last point that we have here with Gil and post-feminism.
Individualism.
Ooh, focus on individualism. Yeah, take it away, Chelsea.
So individualism, you could argue it would probably be like the main theme, I would say, of both movies, at least one of the main themes. So as Gil says, it's like notions of choice, of being oneself, of pleasing oneself are central to the post-feminist sensibility that fuses contemporary Western media culture. So like we said, big core moments of these films. So we were looking at Nancy Drew. There was an interview with Emma Roberts like when the movie was coming out, and this is from like some sort of news article. But Emma Roberts says, talking about Nancy Drew, she's okay with being herself. In a lot of movies, that's the theme. Yet by the end, the character becomes completely different in order to fit in, and that is not Nancy at all. She is completely staunch in her ways. She does not change to really fit anyone's ideals. There's a lot of moments where like it kind of pushes that people are like trying to get her to change. For example, her dad, like her entire thing with her dad is that her dad wants her to be normal. Like there's this scene where she had this party, but she didn't intend for it to like be a really big party. It's supposed to be like kind of a gathering of some like close friends, and then some girls invited like the entire school, and it kind of gets out of hand where things are broken. People are probably drinking like a crazy party, and her dad comes home, and instead of like berating her because like the police were called, he was like, oh my god, you're finally normal. And she like is like, okay, but she's like doesn't really push back on that because her dad wants her to be normal, but like she knows in herself, like in her heart of hearts, that is not true. Another important moment is to talk about like clothing, because we kind of touched on it earlier, but Nancy's clothing is like a big part of who she is.
Our last still for our video.
Oh yeah, it's a big part of who she is. Her clothing really sets her apart from a lot of characters in it, especially since there's the whole like dichotomy of her having like kind of like 1950s era fashion, but being in like the early 2000s, and like the whole sequence where she's like going to school in her clothes and everybody's dressed in like early 2000s fashion, and she's dressed like that, and people are like looking at her strangely, but she doesn't ever try to convert to like what is considered like fashionable or trendy at the time. There's a scene where she's going to have a makeover, which we'll touch on later, about like with some friends, and they're like, yeah, we need to change her look. Her look is a little dated, and she's like, I don't want to change my look though, because all of these clothes I make myself, and they come from patterns that my mother developed, and it's really just that is something holistically for her that like pleases her, and she never like strays away from that even by the end of the film.
Yeah, and I mean that makeover montage thing is what Gil talks about in post-feminism. It's so prevalent. And the thing is, there are so many montages in Nancy Drew. Like, they are constantly, when she arrives to the Hollywood high school, there's montage of the school, of her point of view, of how it's strange and weird to her. But she never is in a montage where she has to change. And, again, that artist intent and making sure that they incorporated in the story. They could have just thrown her into her 1950s clothes and been like, deal with it. I mean, actually, we read a review where they were like, it's kind of hard to place the time and place in which Nancy Drew is in until she arrives in LA. But they took the time to be like, no, this is in semblance to her mother, and she, you know, cares about taking the time to really develop these patterns and sew them herself. And she's not going to change that just because her friends, and actually, as Chelsea said, her friends end up wearing the penny loafers. And so I think all in all, that lack of a makeover montage actually excluding Nancy Drew from the post-feminist narrative. And even Kit Kittredge has a makeover in it, and that
a glow down.
Kit herself has a glow down in terms of socioeconomic status, and so she ends up having to wear chicken seed dresses.
Yeah, and that was a big thing in it.
And then County has the glow up though, and it's very like male centered in the because Will's like, oh, I have something to show you all, and then one of the young boy boarders is like, what? And then Will's like, yeah, County's a girl, and we see a pan up shot of County, and she steps into the scene. You just see her boobs, and then you slowly see the dress, and then it goes all the way up, and you see her little pigtails with the bows, and you're like, oh my gosh, they put so much femininity, like, aesthetic into this. And so even Kit Kittredge has a montage, but again, post-feminism, you can have duality, and that is okay. So I think, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on, Chelsea?
I do not think so.
Yeah.
I feel like we should probably wrap up.
Yeah, we have been talking a lot about our feminism and post-feminism in our set of 2000s movies, and so I was
gonna say there's other parts that like Gil talks about, but there's a lot more to that. But
yeah.
We're only gonna touch on a few like the most important ones. But another thing I just want to also briefly mention is empowerment and choice and empowerment, because these characters make a lot of choices, and those choices are empowering, I would say. Like, as the titular female leads, as the sleuths, they're the ones who go after to find these clues. They're the ones that go against what everybody says. Like, Kit breaks into the room of the people she believes stole the lockbox, even though it does put herself and her friends into danger. But those choices do end up empowering her by the end. And same with Nancy Drew, how she continues to sleuth even though her father told her not to. It does end up putting her in danger sometimes. I think that
coughing, I'm agreeing with you, yeah.
Like the car chase scene and all of that, but it does end up empowering her by the end. So just like keeping in mind like the empowerment and the intention behind those choices, and making it extremely clear that these women are going against what is being told of them, asked of them.
Yeah, so ultimately we have two great childhood movies here that Chelsea and I really enjoy, and I think they hold up. They stand the test of time.
I would say so, yeah.
Over a decade later. So if all I'm saying to all of our fellow artists out there and consumers of media is, if American Girl doll could do it in 2007,
2007,
then so can you in the year of 2023. And so really emphasizing that who is our audience in these things? What are they going to pick up on that we're giving them? Because we can give kids more.
We can, and we should.
And we should. We should give young girls more, and all of the young kiddos out there more. What are they going to pick up on? What are we giving them? And how can we give them more?
Exactly. We need more feminist media. So as artists, we have to take the reins for that, and hopefully create more artists as well who want to keep pushing the narrative along.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's apparent too once you get diversity into the films themselves and into the writer and the director's room as well. And I mean, that's what we really have to keep pushing for. And then in our media itself, making sure that we're meeting standards of feminism, and we're meeting standards even of post-feminism, whatever that may be in the future. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. Yeah, oh my goodness.
Watch those movies. They're very good.
They are. All right. I guess we'll be
Podcast
signing
out.
off. Two Wartists having one convo.
One combo.
One comment. One convo.
A lot of comments.
A lot of comments.
Yeah.
But we're out. We're done Wartisting on you. So, all right. Thanks so much, y'all.
Bye.